Las cosas que están aquí son las formas de vivencia y de existir concretamente puertorriqueñas, tanto en la historia como en la multitud de contextos en que viven los puertorriqueños en este momento. Es decir, parte del efecto de esa migración, que ahora hay casi la mitad de los puertorriqueños están en Estados Unidos, y no solamente en un lugar, sino en varios lugares, que en la isla mismo han habido procesos de transformación. Quiere decir que la cultura puertorriqueña no es una cosa dada así, sentada, petrificada, es una cosa constantemente en transformación, con una multiplicidad de formas de expresión que ahora se reencuentran en un evento como este y se reconocen como cosas que unifican y que tenemos posibilidades de compartir y celebrar.
Buenas, bienvenidos. Acabamos de ver un clip de Frank Bonilla. We just saw a clip from Frank Bonilla, founding director of CENTRO. My name is Yarimar Bonilla. I am the current director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and we are here to kick off our 50th Anniversary Symposium with a conversation about theorizing diasporas past and future. I welcome you, and I would like to welcome our guests. Although they need no introduction, let me just say that we are very honored to have Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones with us today. Arcadio taught at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras from 1970 to 1982 before joining the Princeton faculty in 1983. At Princeton, he served as director of the program in Latin American Studies, and he also taught briefly at Hostos Community College and was a longtime friend of CENTRO. He is the author of numerous groundbreaking works that continue to inform the work of CENTRO today, such as La Memoria Rota y El Arte de Bregar. We also have Dr. Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez, who is an Afro-Puerto Rican writer, teacher, and scholar from Hoboken, New Jersey. She is Associate Professor of Afro-Diaspora Studies at Michigan State University and the author of the path-breaking Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature. So thank you, Yomaira and Arcadio, for joining us today for this conversation. I would like to begin with you, Arcadio. Can you please start us off by sharing your recollections of your first encounter with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and your memories of the political and intellectual climate of that time?
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Thank you so much. It's really an honor for me to be here with you today and celebrating this important anniversary, the founding of CENTRO. We are proud to honor the founders and those who have continued and to celebrate the achievements that are, I think, exemplary for activists, for artists, for citizens, in imagining and reimagining and what CENTRO could be, what CENTRO can be. I think I will devote my time here, in fact, to bear witness, to those, to the beginnings, and also to some of the moments in the history of CENTRO that I treasure in my own memory. As a matter of fact, I would like to begin with two quotes, because we are remembering today. An anniversary is an occasion to remember. And as you know, memory for me is central as a literary scholar, but also for my own memories too. The first quote is from Pedro Pietri, a poet that is very much linked to the history of those years, that CENTRO and the New Yorican Poets Café. Pedro Pietri writes in El Puerto Rican Embassy Manifesto, he writes, "The power of memory eliminates the threat of extinction." Memory eliminates the threat of extinction. We have no intention, he says, of forgetting who we were and who we are. think that's a very, I could quote many other lines from Pedro Pietri, from Puerto Rican Obituary, but I think that those lines are crucial to what we're doing today here and what CENTRO has done, no? Eliminating the threat of extinction. And the other is from Puerto Rican poet, also Angela Maria Dávila, a quote that I have used elsewhere and I like very much. She wrote in Animal Fiero y Tierno, recordando el futuro imaginario, inventando y planeando ese poderosísimo pasado. Those lines which are, very deep, very profound about reimagining the past, which also means reimagining or imagining the future. And I think that's is the core of what we're doing here today. While I've been thinking about this anniversary, I've been reading a wonderful book by my colleague Jeremy Edelman and Guillaume Prakash, post-colonial studies and Latin American history too. And it's a book titled Imagining the Third World. It's a very beautiful, important volume, an edited volume, published by Bloomsbury, and it's free access. So the wonderful essays there, and it has a preface, a very beautiful preface by Homi Bhabha. I think it was pure coincidence, but I enjoyed reading that volume while thinking about CENTRO, because what they're writing about is the third world, the idea of the third world in the 60s and the 70s, in the post-war period. The idea, the utopia of the third world, an international movement, an urge, as they say, for an alternative world, the idea that there could be an alternative world based on decolonization and the creation of states. A lot of that tragically ended in deception and also destruction, actually, and dystopia in many cases, and which is still happening in many ways, failures and disenchantment. But as they say, Edelman and Prakash, the idea of an alternative world does not die. That idea does not die, and we are in many ways today also seeing other ways of establishing relationships, sharing utopias, sharing activism, awareness of injustice, awareness of the need to save the planet, and so forth. And that takes me right to the civil rights movement and to the context of the creation of 50 years ago of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. Of course, the context in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, which Angela Davis recently reminded us that it should be called the fight for Black freedom. And I think it's so important because that was, it's part of, we saw in that, even in that brief clip that you showed us now about Frank Bonilla, that's there, very vibrant, no? And it's a key word, Black freedom, in the context of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. The other important event process is the Vietnam Wars, in plural, and the resistance, and the militant resistance to that war by Puerto Ricanos and so many others in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora, which was not then called diaspora. And of course, important figures such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, extremely important, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords. And I want to show an image, if I may, there by Martorell, a graphic art. There we have a portrait of Betances, but Betances as a young lord, a 1970 image of Betances by Puerto Rican artist Antonio Martorell. And I think it's very telling that this, you see the Lares flag there, and it takes us right to the period that we're talking about, the foundation, the rediscovery of Betances, reclaiming radical history in the island and in the diaspora, and also, of course, the presence of the signs of Blackness. And here we have a very unique Betances that could serve as a point of departure for a reflection on the context of the creation of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. The other important event, of course, the Chicano movements and the feminist movements all play a role, as we have seen in the history of the Young Lords as well. The Cuban Revolution and the debates around the Cuban Revolution, both things are central. And of course, the debate about decolonization. And it's interesting, I use that word very deliberately because now perhaps one of the changes, anticipating the question and answer period, is we talk a lot about decolonization, what does it mean today, but also decolonizing, which is a different, and I think Yomaira has a lot to say to us about that too, decolonizing. The discussion about slavery and colonialism is the context of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, of the Foundation for Puerto Rican Studies. Part of the context, and very important too, of course, is the writers and the arts. It's the period of the New Yorican Poets Cafe, the poetry, Pedro Pietri and many others. The writers like Sandra Maria Esteves in the 70s too, Manuel Ramos Otero, Tato Laviera, but other writers, non-Puerto Ricans, who were read by Puerto Ricans, like later on Bell Hooks, very important, Talking Back, no? Very important, Toni Morrison, Luis Rafael Sanchez, La Guagua Aérea. There's I could not even begin to summarize the importance of the writers. And also, I would like to stress the creation, for me, very important. I visited during those years, and it was it really left a very deep mark. El Museo del Barrio. El Museo del Barrio is part for me of the creation also of CENTRO and the important name of Rafael Montañez Ortiz in those years. So we have writers, artists, and even now Martorell in those years too, doing new Betances. So that's the context of the Centro's imaginary and how and by whom it has been imagined. I think it was, I want to remember a few names. And if I may, Yarimar, I would like to mention a few names and to pay tribute to them. Some of them we have lost, and I grieve for them too, but I think I celebrate their memory. But many of the founders and those who helped establish the institution are fortunately with us and working with us. First of all, of course, Frank Bonilla. And what I would like to underline about Frank Bonilla is that, and it's important for the discussion today, how Frank left the academic world at Stanford University, where he was, and came back to New York, his birthplace, his home, and became a leader, an academic and a political leader at CENTRO, and defined the position of director of CENTRO in many ways, and created a CENTRO for oriented towards policy making, but also very sensitive to all the activism in the US and in other countries as well, part of the third world imaginary. And I call him a truly, he was trying very hard to be an organic intellectual. not an academic intellectual in the sense of the ivory tower. He was an organic intellectual and set an example in so many ways. But he was not alone. He was always, and I remember my first visits when CENTRO was still at, what was it, 5th Avenue and 42nd, you know, the small offices where CENTRO had already a library, and then later on at John Jay College before moving to Hunter. And I remember that I must have met in one of those places Juan Flores and others, Nelida Perez, founder really of the archives and the library. I want to pay tribute to Nelida today, as we have done in other occasions, because her job was crucial in imagining and reimagining the archives. And that's, I think, a very important, as crucial as someone like Virginia Sanchez-Corol, a scholar, a founder too, who started and set the standard for a really remarkable documentation of our migration. But other archivists like Pedro Juan Hernandez, who worked later with Nelida Perez and retired recently, a few years ago. Pedro Juan, along with another group, also created part of those wonderful, important archives that we have today. At a time when some younger scholars and activists are questioning the role of museums and archives. That's important too, or the idea, how are archives conceived. Edna Acosta Belén, a scholar, an educator. And it's so interesting because many of them, like Frank, are scholars who really became educators in the sense of social activism and very alert to what's happening socially, very alert to the movements, and very interested in pedagogical resources and creating pedagogical resources. And that has been a great tradition in CENTRO. Or I would like to mention some names here and persons that I admired and I admire who were closely associated with CENTRO too, like Susana Torruella Leval, who directed del Museo del Barrio in very creative ways and so important, and was part of the board of CENTRO for a number of years as well, and did a wonderful job there and training some of our young curators. Juan Flores, the Diaspora Strikes Back, very, he was an innovator, a critical thinker, the definition also of culture, popular culture, music, and Juan also very interested in literature. He combined his literary passions with political descriptions and also the very idea of popular culture. He was very, in many ways, very similar to the role that Stuart Hall played in other contexts too, and very close to Stuart Hall. I think very close intellectually, I mean. And yeah.
I see a lot of people in the chat giving shout outs to Juan Flores. I can't resist jumping in and saying that we are working on a Juan Flores reader that will be coming out through CENTRO very soon.
And if we say Juan, we also have to say immediately Miriam Jimenez. Because Miriam was also related, working also for the CENTRO Journal, another great accomplishment, the CENTRO Journal, originally the Bulletin, I remember, and then became the Journal, one of the great achievements of CENTRO, and its editors. And Miriam also, of course, for the Afro-Latino reader. I met her first at Schomburg when she was at Schomburg. Then she was also always very critical of some of the policies or views of CENTRO and of some of the centers, and rightly so, and very hardworking, extremely well-informed, and wonderful to be with. No? Miriam Jimenez, but also I want to mention others, no? The task force. I remember, and I want to point that out, I mentioned that to Yarimar, I think in one of our conversations, that the cuadernos, the task force in the 70s, and I cannot mention all the names that I should there, but one of the beginnings, I think part of the beginnings of CENTRO was these meetings, conferences, and they were called task forces, and they created cuadernos, cuadernos on history, on language policy task force. I remember film and video task force that came later, I think, and those were crucial to the scholarship, a new description, new research. And I am sorry that now I don't have, that's one of the age and retirement. You lose so many things. And I kept for many years the cuadernos, those mimeograph cuadernos, and beautifully illustrated and with portadas by artists as well. And
Arcadio, cuando quiera, you can come to the library. We have them all. I'm sure Aníbal and Lindsay in the library will be happy to pull them all out for you.
I think I want to see them again. That's one of the things I really would like to do, because it brings back so many memories. The way now we are in this digital age, but I still remember those big cuadernos that I enjoyed reading and that I used in my classes. It was so helpful. I want to remember also, of course, Juan Flores became director, but directors of CENTRO, Felix Matos, who did a wonderful job too when he was director, a historian and also an educator. And I think it's that combination is so important, has been so important and beneficial for CENTRO and its activity. His studies about migration and about women too. And the publications became very important too under Felix Matos. And Edwin Melendez, who I think we owe to Edwin a reinvigorating study of diasporic communities, and with numbers. I learned so much of his detailed mapping, a mapping of the diasporic communities that he published. He has been publishing with Carlos Vargas. I think we have learned a lot from Promesa also, and that because of his sociological and his interest in statistics. And now, thanks in part to Edwin and to many others, we have a better idea of the magnitude of the diaspora, the diasporic communities, the diasporas in the plural, in various parts of the country. I would like to mention, of course, Congressman Nidia Velázquez, Congresswoman Nidia Velázquez, and Congressman Jose Serrano, because I really met them at CENTRO very briefly, but I want to express here my gratitude, like so many others, Nidia Velázquez, who at one point taught Puerto Rican Studies, and CENTRO really is born in great part because of the struggle for Puerto Rican studies, the creation of studies, of Puerto Rican studies. And Nidia Velázquez, a very young Nidia Velázquez, was teaching Puerto Rican studies, and then she was very instrumental when she passed to the migration office.
Yeah, I think a few people know. Yeah, she taught at the University of Puerto Rico in Humacao, and then she was an adjunct professor here at Hunter College.
Yeah. And also that she was very instrumental in transferring, depositing the archives of the Office of Migration to the to CENTRO, and that's central, And I'm always grateful to Congressman Serrano, because I've used them myself a lot for those FBI documents. I think that was a very important moment too, politically and historically, when we were able to finally see part of the repression and the surveillance of all Puerto Ricans in the insula, the archipelago, and in the cities. I spent years reading documents. I printed so much, and now for some reason I don't see them online. Yarimar, I don't know why, but
we're working on it.
Okay.
Están online. You can find them in the Wayback Machine, and you can get to them.
Okay.
Before people come at me in the chat and send me a flood of emails. We're working on bringing them back in a better way, but they're still available.
I'm always eager to go in the Wayback Machine. That's what I do now most of the time. I'm in some machine out there in time, in the past, but very related. And then Alberto Hernandez, who was also a director of the library, he was very encouraging and very creative with what we did. And I would like to just remember some of the friends I made at CENTRO Library, Jorge Matos. I met with Orlando Hernandez, who has been doing so much work on Hostos and taught at Hostos Community College too. Edgardo Melendez, who's this wonderful book, Sponsored Migration. And I think Edgardo has been also very important for the redefinition of the studies of migration. I could go on and on,
we would love for you to, but let's get Yomaira in here as well.
Yes. Okay.
Yomaira, can we hear a little bit from you? About your relationship to CENTRO, to Puerto Rican Studies, and to the concept of diaspora that we're thinking through here today.
For sure, yeah. I mean, one of the, on the academic side, I wrote Decolonizing Diasporas, and the way that I think about diasporas, obviously from the lived experience of being, Puerto Rican, born and raised in Hoboken, New Jersey, right outside of Manhattan, right? And so I've always thought about diaspora as this kind of like overlapping and ongoing phenomenon, right? Always in relationship to other diasporas. But I think one of the things that was really compelling to me was that clip that you showed of Frank Bonilla at the very beginning, where he said something like, I guess like in 1973 or in the 70s, like casi la mitad de los puertorriqueños, almost half of Puerto Ricans are, in the US. Pero ahora now, 50 years later, in 2023, it's more than half, right? The majority of Puerto Ricans are here in the diaspora. And so in terms of thinking about my own lived experience as being a diasporic Puerto Rican, it's a kind of incredible feeling to know that we are inheritors of CENTRO as a kind of a space with radical history, a place that has been able to speak to the lived experiences of Puerto Ricans and other communities, like Caribbean, Latinx, Caribbean, and communities of color in the New York area and beyond. My own experience growing up in Hoboken, it was kind of in many ways an enclave of Puerto Ricans. It had the largest population of Puerto Ricans per capita of anywhere in the United States during the time that I was raised there. And so I grew up in a Puerto Rican neighborhood speaking only Spanish, with the bodegas, with the viveros, with the, carnicerias, and, all of the things that made a beautiful experience of growing up, and so much so that I learned English in school, right? Like I went to school only speaking Spanish. And so for me, that was an incredible way to think about the multiple ways that one can come up being Puerto Rican, right? And to think about my own family's connection to New York City, my own family's relationship to El Barrio, where my grandmother first migrated in the 1950s before returning to Puerto Rico, to, Loisaida, to the South Bronx, where I still have family, to Los Sudes in Brooklyn, where my family is still holding on strong to South 4th Street, And so for me, that has been an incredible experience to think about what diaspora actually means for the Puerto Rican experience, not only within the New York metro area, but outside of it. I've had the opportunity to live as a Puerto Rican, not just in New York and New Jersey, but también, also in California, and also now in the Midwest. So it's actually a quite, unique experience for me to be able to have those moments And then to always know that, you know, Centro is this this place that is not just historic in its founding, but it's a place that holds our history, right? It's the place that has been designated and been created by the community for the community, right? As a place that, you know, we know that, you know, like Arcadio was saying, like the cuadernos they no longer have, but you know what, they're at Centro and we can actually look at them again, right? And so for me, that has been, you know, kind of the way that I think about Centro as a place that not only like holds history, but also makes history, right? Because it's not just about thinking about the past, but actually thinking about our present moment, the conditions that we are facing as Puerto Ricans in the archipelago, in the diaspora, but also what do we want the future to look like, right? Again, thinking back to Frank Bonilla's words, right? What is the next 50 years going to look like for más de la mitad de los puertorriqueños, you know? So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to pull in a question from the public, from the audience, and people can keep putting questions in the Q&A box. But Dania Abreu Torres asked, how do you think Centro has contributed to bridge the gap between the diaspora and the islanders? What strategies have been most successful? I want to pose this question, but also use it as a question to ask you both to reflect from your different perspectives on the concept of diaspora itself. You know, some folks in Puerto Rico, I mean, some folks in the US take issue with being called diasporicos. I know a lot of folks who say, yo no soy diaspora, yo soy boricua, yo soy puertorriqueño, and they don't like that, you know, that term. And obviously, you know, there's the longstanding questions about who's real Puerto Rican or most Puerto Ricans, or even like an appropriate diasporican, because I didn't grow up in Hoboken or in Los Sures. I was in Topeka, Kansas. So I feel like my diaspora experience is not real or authentic, right? Can you both reflect a little bit on how you've approached the concept of diaspora and the relationships, you know, between our different communities and geographies? Arcadio, can you start us off?
Now that's a big question, a very important question. So only, let's say, just to begin, no? Very important question. I think, first of all, I would like to say that Centro, since the very beginning, had the vision, and that was Frank and those who were at Centro at the very beginning, that there had to be very, very important connections with groups and institutions in the archipelago. And I know from my own personal experience, because there was a strong connection of Centro with CEREP, Centro de Estudio de la Realidad Puertorriqueña. That's why I know about the task forces, and because I was a member of CEREP too. And Frank and others, not only did they knew a lot about what was going on politically and academically in the island, and very interested in the policies, and very critical too at the same time, but they had good friends and in a network at the University of Puerto Rico. No, I remember Milton Pavón was a close collaborator in those early years, and CEREP too. Some of our colleagues in CEREP were part of that connection with Centro and traveled to New York and came back. So that was important then. And I think there was an exchange program that was developed too, that was very significant, I think. And it's clear for me in the development of Centro Journal, where we have collaborators from the archipelago and from the diaspora. So there's more to be said about all that, but I think there's a desire to establish those connections, and politically, the movement against the Vietnam War was also very strong in the island, and as was the movement for the women's that initial feminist movement too, and there were connections with Centro. Some of them full of tensions, because there are tensions. And that's the other point I want to make. There are tensions in different aspects, linguistic, culturally, political tensions too, different groups. So tensions are part of the history. And that's still true today. And let me point out something that was very important, and I didn't have time to mention it before, that CENTRO had, and I want to remember the name of Rina Benmayor. Rina Benmayor, Rosa Torruellas, Ana Juarbe, whom I met, all of them. They had a wonderful project that's still there, oral history, especially the lived experience of Puerto Rican women, which was at the very core of Rina Benmayor's project. And they not only did interviews, but also transcriptions of those interviews. And I think that was another link to the island too, because they studied migration and they raised very centrally the question of gender, because there was a tendency to talk only about class and not gender. And I think CENTRO, like the poets and the writers, changed that, and the activists. And that's another expression, I think, of the relationship with the island institutions and with movements, because there was an interesting connection there, trying to document migration from the point of view of not only workers, but women workers and women who were really in conditions of extreme poverty as well in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora. I think that's another important consideration there. I would, maybe later I can talk about return, because I'm interested in the question of diasporic return, and that's, maybe later I can say something about that.
Yomaira, what about you? I know you have a thought or two about diaspora, ¿verdad?
Yeah.
I thought it too, for sure. So I think one of the things that is clear, first off, is that when I got talking about tensions and kind of in the question thinking about like, who is the real Puerto Rican? What is the real Puerto Rican experience? What is the real, Diasporican and New Rican experience? Do we even want the word diaspora? One of the things that's kind of inherent to some of the ways that those questions or those tensions are formed is this idea of a hierarchy, of a particular form of authenticity, right? And I think one of the things that we need to ensure that we're doing and that we continue to do is to refuse the hierarchy of Puerto Rican authenticity, right? Who gets to make the claim, who gets to be the real Puerto Rican, who isn't. And I think this, for me, as a Black Boricua, as an Afro-Puerto Rican woman from Vega Baja and from Caguas, is also something that I have experienced in a material way on the ground, right? When I'm in Puerto Rico, I'm like, ay, pero qué lindo el español. Tú eres de Loíza? And I'm like, no, I'm not. Just guess where else could I be from, right? But this idea that your Puerto Ricanness can be reduced to a particular place, to a particular time frame or period, I think it's something that we're constantly trying to like disabuse ourselves in our communities of, and oftentimes because of the messages that we get, right? So much of the kind of cultural cues, right? And off the offhand and the kind of colloquialism, those dichos and all these other kinds of things. So I think when we're thinking about the question of who we are as Puerto Ricans and who gets to make that claim, there is the question of like, who is the authentic Puerto Rican? We need to really disabuse ourselves of that. But I think in terms of terminology, there is, for me, I've done a very deep, many decades long study of diaspora, what diaspora is, how it offers us. We know that Puerto Ricans are part of the African diaspora, right? Like we are part of this longer history of the transatlantic slave trade. But the reality is, if we look at the kind of basic principles of diaspora, if you want to call it migration, you can call it that. If you want to call it diaspora, you can call it that, right? But the fact that the majority of Puerto Ricans are in the United States right now, and that Puerto Rico is the world's oldest colony, and that, there is not only a brain drain, but a youth drain out of Puerto Rico to the US due to the conditions of austerity, due to climate change, right? Due to ongoing management from La Junta and colonial governance. I mean, these are the conditions for a diasporic move, right? And I'm thinking about the fact that in the Frank Bonilla documentary, there's a lot of folks talking about diaspora, like diaspora, they weren't saying it back then. That wasn't even the word back then. There's a lot of what's being called out in the documentary. And it shows us the kind of mark and the move of the terminology as we begin to refine and redefine the phenomena that we are living under, these conditions, right? And I'm currently working on the Frank Espada project, right? I'm working with the archive and with the Espada family on the Puerto Rican Diaspora project. And this is also something that has come up. Yolanda Martinez San Miguel had told me that when Espada was putting together the Puerto Rican Diaspora project, one of the big fights that he had were people being like, what is diaspora? What are you saying that we're not diaspora? That's not what we are, right? In the time period in the early 1980s, when he's saying like, okay, I'm gonna do a photo capture of the Puerto Rican diaspora itself. And now this is a word that we're kind of using more often now. At the same time, I respect the way that people want to self-identify or disidentify with that term. Like, I'm not trying to say like, this is a term that you have to use, but I think it's a phenomenon that is a fact, right? Like it is a fact of a phenomenon. I think that rather than try to force that word on folks who don't want to identify with that or would like to see themselves having a different form of self-determination around what they want to be categorized or how they want to be seen, I think it's important to understand that the goal for us in Puerto Rican studies, the goal for us as community members, as scholars, as artists, as thinkers, is not necessarily to create one singular narrative about who we are as a people, right? Because that would be reductive. And so I think that instead we would have to attend to the ways that Puerto Rican identity is fractured across racial lines, gender lines, sexuality, class, definitely. All of these things affect how we understand ourselves and how we act upon the world as Puerto Ricans, right? Yeah. All that to say that these have a real world consequences and political implications, right? At the social level, at the cultural level, at the linguistic level, et cetera. And so in that way, I think the question of diaspora is a really broad one and really important and really complicated. And while I can like sit here and give the definitions and how we fall into the different definitions of what diaspora looks like, I think it's important for us to kind of think about what that would mean on the ground. What would it mean for me to explain to my family? I'm a first generation high school graduate. So when I'm talking about my work with my family, I'm always like, okay, vamos a ver, like, voy a explicarlo así, vamos a suponer esto, blah, 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 like, explaining it in a way that makes sense and not just, trying to make everyone fall into the kind of like jargon and kind of practice that we have and the shorthand that we have, oftentimes as scholars talking to one another. So anyway, that's what I think.
Yeah.
Arcadio, do you want to react? Yes.
Yes, well, I agree with what Yomaira has stated. I just want to go back to one aspect, which is belonging, the idea of belonging and diaspora. I remember a time when the debate was not on the word and the concept diaspora, but on the hyphen. Should we call ourselves Puerto Ricans / Americans or not? And many people rejected that. I rejected it too, because of the national adjective I prefer, Boricuas or Puertorriqueños, etc. So there will be I understand that it might be very intimidating as a concept, diaspora. No, it can be intimidating. It can be too abstract. But I think, of course, we should use it too. I don't want to, as Yomaira said, we cannot impose that, but it's useful in so many ways, and also useful because it allows us to see diasporas in the plural, no? The coming together of different diasporic communities. That's very important to me. I would say belonging. No one can deny to another person the sense of belonging. If you feel, that, but behind that denial, sometimes, not always, there is a classist also attitude and prejudice. Class plays a very important role And I think that's what Juan Flores brings up, of course, in the Diaspora Strikes Back, the idea that Puerto Ricans of the elite, patriarchal system, that they are the true Puerto Ricans, and that the Spanish is the only language that we have, so forth and so on. This exclusion and erasure of others will always be there with one term or another, no matter what term we use. And it's a real issue, a real problem that we have to debate. I would like to mention too Las Memorias de Bernardo Vega, because that was Las Memorias de Bernardo Vega, the memoirs of Bernardo Vega, open up the discussion of the term was not used so much diaspora, but of the history. Good. And that's translated by Juan Flores, which I think it allows me to pay tribute to César Andreu Iglesias, who was the editor of Bernardo Vega. And I remember reading that book, and I had known César for a little while, and Jose Luis González. That was a real contribution, an incredible contribution. But not the only one. And I think translation plays a role too in the diasporic experience, a central role. No? One thing is imposed, let's say, English, and another thing is bilingualism and translation. And part of the diasporic experience is translation. And I felt really, I think I was, in many occasions, I couldn't understand why the elite members in Puerto Rico, members of the elite, were so proud to be bilingual and perfectly bilingual in English and Spanish, and yet they rejected the diasporic community because they couldn't speak Spanish well. Let's say, that kind of social prejudice, which is parallel to racial prejudice and other prejudices too. And now that I also mentioned Bernardo Vega, we have to remember the enormous contribution to diasporic communities and the study of class and diaspora by Ricardo Campos. Ricardo Campos is also someone I want to pay tribute to here, because he was there. He knew very well the tradition of Bernardo Vega. He was an interlocutor for César Andreu too, and he was a member. He was in Puerto Rico in CEREP, and then he came to New York. So that's another example of connections of institutions, CENTRO and CEREP. And Ricardo Campos was really so knowledgeable on the history of the working class history. And he was a founding member of CENTRO. And he also had a lot to do with the canonization of Memorias de Bernardo Vega, which is an important text to begin to talk about diaspora. And what I like, many of the things I like about Bernardo Vega, Las Memorias, and the creative job that César Andreu did, was that it pays attention to many silenced groups, radical communists and nationalists, socialists, anarchists in the history of Puerto Rican, in the Puerto Rican community. That's crucial. And it's very important today. Unfortunately, I think I am so glad to see that there's a new generation of scholars working in that area on the importance of the communist tradition, the socialist tradition, the radical nationalists. No? That's a whole, and that's all in Bernardo Vega. I mean, at least in a very in a condensed way. In a condensed way, we have the tradition, Puerto Rico Puerto Rico and New York in the 1930s, for instance. And can we call that diaspora? Yes, of course. It's a category that we should use, and it's been used very creatively, and from Winston James to the anthropologists. It's a very important category, as important as I would say, because I'm also a reader of poets, as Gloria and Saldúa, and Borders are Frontiers. And I cannot say anything in that sense better than what Gloria and Saldúa said about the tensions. The frontiers and the borders are full of tensions. We just have to accept them and continue the conversation.
I want to bring in some more questions from the chat, weaving them with my own questions. We have a couple of folks asking about politics, about positions that Centro should take in relation to decolonization. Centro currently has a decolonization study group that is at work. We had an event yesterday. We will continue to have events, and we will be putting out a report soon. But thinking about the founding moment of Centro, Arcadio, you were making reference to all these political movements, and obviously in the founding principles of Centro was support for decolonization. Centro founders were proud Marxist, leftist, anti-colonialist. Can you say a little bit more about the political work of Centro historically? And also would love to hear from both of you about how you see the political importance of Centro today. I mean, I argue that we are in an equally turbulent time politically, yes, as what you laid out, Arcadio. You know, we have the movement for Black freedom, we have the bans on critical ethnic studies, we have, you know, books being banned in Florida, and not to mention all the, you know, the challenges, to put it a euphemism on it, going on in Puerto Rico. Talk to us a little bit about how that political context then and this political context now informs the work of Centro and of Puerto Rican studies more broadly.
Well, let me try.
To begin, Arcadio.
So, I am a follower, a devout student of Edward Said, and beginnings are always necessary and difficult. Yes, I think that this is a very important, I would say, very worrisome period, very troublesome, very violent too, and as violent as the 1960s and 70s because of racism, the banning of books, the wars, the violence against the planet, and capitalism and neoliberalism in so many ways are triumphant. And I think that has all the implications that we know. Centro was was founded as an activist, scholarly group too. I think that Centro has been political from the very beginning. The politics of language, the politics of class awareness too, the politics of fighting a system that was so racist. No, that has been present since the very beginning at Centro. And I think that today we expect Centro to be, I think what's being done with this symposium and group working on decolonization is the right thing to do, in the sense that it helps us to think and to study. These are very complex issues. We need to assume that complexity, and we need help to raise the questions, to study them, to be well informed, and to open up the discussion. I think that's the role of Centro, and I think Centro is doing it. There is I think I'm particularly concerned because of the banning of books too, because there's so many that affects us immediately, no? Everywhere, no matter where the diaspora community is. It's in Puerto Rico too, because it has consequences. What's going to happen to librarians? Many of them are afraid too, because this has been very well organized, and they become victims as well. Not only the books, and the authors, but librarians, and the idea of recommending books to schools. And so that's a very important issue that CENTRO needs to address and discuss, and all the implications that has. It can be very important for CENTRO. But we also have, and that won't disappear, the discussion about, of course, race and the teaching about race and racism, which is, of course, was at the very beginning of CENTRO and is still relevant today. I think, in that sense, I go to what I was suggesting at the beginning. The idea of the third world, as Jeremy Edelman and Prakash said, is an idea. You can date it. Many people say the third world is dead, the idea of the third world. But the alternative, the idea of an alternative world never dies. In that sense, there's so many Puerto Ricanas y Puerto Ricanos who are part of society, maybe thinking now more about democracy. What does it really mean, a democratic society? Maybe is the nation state the best way to create a more democratic society, or not? Is our anti-colonialism enough? There's a question about the old political parties in Puerto Rico, many questions. But is there a possibility of a new, more democratic movement? CENTRO is part of that, whether it likes it or not.
Yeah, I think building on that, Arcadio, I really love that that idea, right? Because I think the question is, we have existing paradigms for political movements and ideologies, and I think we deep in ourselves know that those existing paradigms are not enough, right? That there has to be a visioning of something else that is possible, that is not just anti-colonial, that it might not just be decolonial, that it cannot be just, liberal or democratic or whatever the case may be. But that deep in us, that we know the answer is working together to create a different kind of world, to envision a different kind of future. And so to that end, I think for me, thinking about decolonization, that we understand it to not just be a politics, but also a larger project. And I think thinking back to Bonilla, I think even in the founding of CENTRO, they knew that the institution itself was not a solution, right? Yep. But it was a tool. The CENTRO was a tool, CUNY was a tool, the Forward Foundation that helped to fund it was a tool, right? One tool in a larger toolkit that had some herramientas, but still others needed to be built, right? And that in that way, CENTRO, as you noted, was a hub and continues to be and can be a really important political hub for this kind of critical work, right? And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to not only kind of facilitate, but also disseminate a lot of the knowledge and the information that is necessary, right, to equip our communities, right, our families, and ourselves in the ongoing discourse, right? Because it's so divisive, right? Like, I have family who are, extreme right wing out of nowhere, you know what I mean? And that's really scary. How do we have the conversation about how that comes to be, right? And how do we engage, right? And so I think that we have the larger questions of what is the future of Puerto Rico, the archipelago, what is the future of the Puerto Rican diaspora, particularly as, the land right from under our feet is being, purchased and facilitated for foreigners or for outsiders to come purchase it, right? All of that has to happen at the same time that those intimate conversations around questions of politics, around questions of race and racism and colorism, around questions of race, of gender and sexuality, right? All of those things have to come into play. And I think CENTRO does have a role both in the intimate and the political sphere, right? And so I think that for me, I've always understood CENTRO and hope that CENTRO continues to be responsive. And I think we've seen that responding to not just like the popular cultural moments that are important, but also to the political moments that are important. We cannot underestimate, for example, the response of the diaspora to disasters like Hurricane Maria, right?
Yeah.
And how critical, right, that was. But then also supportive, right, of the kinds of directions that, you know, Puerto Ricans, both, you know, at the community level, right, and at the larger kind of national level might need. And I think that we are part of, like, you know, if I were to, you know, understand myself as part of the larger framework of Puerto Rican Studies and CENTRO, is that, you know, we are part and have to be committed to envisioning, right, a decolonized future for Puerto Rico at every level, right, at every single level, and that is just, you know, that is not an easy task. It's a long task. And then lo otro es que oftentimes we can think about, like, you know, we're getting the questions on, like, why doesn't CENTRO do this and CENTRO does that, and CENTRO has this, but CENTRO is a building, right? CENTRO is a space. And what we have to think about is, like, what are the people within CENTRO? Like, what are the roles that they have? And, you know, how do we work together with the people in CENTRO, right, to do this work? And so because of that, I think, you know, we have to consider, again, those multiple dimensions of what decolonization could look like, what Puerto Rico's future can look like, as an envisioning, as the politics, and also our practice as Puerto Ricans in terms of, like, coalition and community building and collaboration. And the beautiful thing is that we have a framework for that. We have a history of doing that coalitional work, that collaborative work, and that envisioned work, and that we don't have to come to it and reinvent the wheel. Or second, we pick up the tools that we have and we start to build and continue to build the future that we want to live in, you know?
That's really beautiful. I have to say, unfortunately, CENTRO is not a building. A lot of folks wish we were. We're a little corner of Hunter College por ahora. Yeah. But I really appreciated what you said, that it's the people and it's the group of people. I have to say, since, you know, taking on the role of interim director, part of what I really wanted to focus on is, you know, opening up the doors of CENTRO to bring more people in and to make also more visible the folks that are here. And tomorrow we're having a full day symposium where all the panels are going to be moderated by different staff members of CENTRO. And also, I've been trying to think through those tensions, right? The tensions, and I appreciated, Yomaira, you saying, you know, it's not just about educating non-Puerto Ricans. Like, we have Puerto Ricans that need to, you know, that we need to do political work with, right? And so the Bridging the Divides initiative is partly, you know, precisely that. Like, how can we come together given our divisions and think from our different places, you know, ideological, geographical, disciplinary spaces, and try to find those points of commonality. For me, and I put the link in the chat of the Frank Bonilla documentary. You know, it's the production value is dated, but
it's a vibe. It's a vibe. You know, I'm not gonna hate on it. I loved it. You know.
Yeah, it's part of our retrofuturist, you know, legacy here at CENTRO.
And Arcadio is in.
Yes, and there's another documentary we need to show where we have footage of Juan Flores in his 20s doing bomba classes and stuff, you know. But it's always been a collective of people. CENTRO appears to be run by, you know, a person in charge, but really it's never been one person. Even, you know, even when it was Frank and Ricardo, Frank and Nelida. It was a collective. And I think that that's part of the magic and the beauty of CENTRO. At least for me, part of what I have fallen in love with CENTRO is the power of collectivity, the dream of collectivity that we have as Puerto Ricans. Right?
That's the meaning of task forces too, collective thinking too, which I think was so important, as opposed to the institutions, academic institutions even today that want us to get ahead. There's a beautiful title by Albert Hirschman, Getting Ahead Collectively, which makes a big difference. It's not just to get ahead individually, but collectively. And I think CENTRO has been that. And it's not easy doing that or accomplishing that within the framework of institutions or capitalism too, because individualism is there, very strong, and the hierarchies are there. I am concerned, very concerned, as a citizen, as a Puerto Riqueño, very concerned with the real threat of extinction. And that's why I quoted Pedro Pietri. The situation of the Universidad de Puerto Rico, for instance. No? It's really the budget cuts, the authoritarianism, the idea, even the how they have been diminished in the press, and colleagues who work there working under circumstances, very difficult circumstances, activists too, who have been persecuted. That's one example. The public university in the archipelago.
Yeah.
That's a real.
And in New York, you know, I always say CUNY is the UPR of New York, you know, and we are also, you know, I sometimes think if you watch the Frank Bonilla documentary, you know, they talk about how there had been movement at Columbia University to start ethnic studies there, start Puerto Rican studies there. Solidarity, they're back in the streets at Colombia trying to, they still haven't gotten an ethnic studies department, right? But it's no coincidence that where CENTRO is founded is at CUNY, and not at Columbia or at NYU, right? And with all the good and all the beauty that brings, but also all the challenges of dealing with, you know, a big public bureaucracy that is also always under threat of the whims of budgetary changes, you know, and we see, you know, we see already there has been, you know, announced budget cuts for CUNY, and so I think there is nothing more fitting than that, than for CENTRO to be at CUNY and to serve as a link. For a long time, there was an exchange program between CUNY and UPR that hopefully we can revive at some point again. But I think it's CUNY is the most appropriate puente between our two, you know, spheres of higher education, I think, for us Puerto Ricans.
I'm also very concerned, and I was glad to hear that Yomaira mentioned it. The critical situation is so critical now too, because I think there's a recent and very dramatic and violent new dispossession of the debate about the constructions and the beaches, and it's a movement of realtors, really, no, who are buying the island very cheaply too. And I don't know what the consequences will be, and I think that's a real issue that we have to, as serious as the public education issue too. Not only in public education, not only the budgets, but the content, no, of that education in public schools, in high schools. So there's a lot there. But I wanted to quote again Pedro Pietri in the embassy manifesto, because just like CENTRO, he says, "El Puerto Rican embassy welcomes you with open arms, regardless of your temporary political sentiments." I think that's very important too, because we have to be willing to sit down and talk and to learn together too, collectively. No, I think it's important. It's not easy. The tensions are there, and the differences of opinion are there too. They were there in the 1920s and 30s in the era of socialism, communism, and anarchism, no, right? Not everyone was a radical nationalist, and not everyone was a communist either. So it's nothing new in that sense. You read Bernardo Vega, and those who are studying those years, the 20s and the 30s, are going back and studying those differences too, no? And how they came together, let's say, in New York in the 1930s, when they were morally incensed by the Ponce massacre, no? But they came together. Or they were also able to support and to be supported by someone like Vito Marcantonio, a leader, no? That's important. Coming together in spite of the tensions and differences. And coming together to support the Spanish Republic too in the 1930s. So we go back to different moments of solidarities and coming togetherness. I think that's important because it gives us hope. I wanted to say one thing about Diaspora, which is already in the book by Juan Flores, which is return. Because we're talking now about, something amazing has happened in these 50 years. Because the fact is a fact, and we owe that knowledge to many of the CENTRO researchers and scholars, that we are now, what is it, close to 6 million persons in the diaspora, and 3 point something in the island, no? Right? We have to begin there too, the complexity of that fact. What does it mean in terms of participation? Not just belonging culturally. I'm not so concerned about belonging, because the artists and the writers have been cultivating that sense of complex belonging and criticism too. We're learning a great deal from the artists, performers, dancers, poets. But I am concerned about political participation.
Yeah, yeah.
Do we have the right to vote in any future of Puerto Rico?
Yeah. Those are questions that we're taking up in bridging the divides.
Yeah.
Even if we don't have the answers, to at least nudge to some of the challenges that any real attempt at decolonization must involve. Arcadio, you make mention of the role of artists, etc. I have to say, coming in as Centro director, one of my main goals was to recenter the arts in the work of Centro, because I think it's so important, has traditionally been so important for our diaspora. And the documentary of Frank Bonilla starts with Toque de Bomba, and that was always a fundamental. There was an arts and culture task force. There was a film task force at Centro. That cultural work has always been central to the work of Centro, and I think it's central to imagining new pathways for a collective future. I wanted to ask you both, you're both literature scholars. How do you see the work of the arts, the work of literature, the work of literary criticism in imagining a new path forward for Centro and for Puerto Rican studies as a whole? Pequeñita pregunta. Yomaira, do you want to start? Because I know you have to leave us at a certain time. Yes.
Yes, in order to catch a flight to San Francisco to go work on the Frank Espada archives as a interesting connection. So looking at the role of art, and for me the role of the photography project in particular. I think as someone who is a literary scholar, an ethnic studies literary scholar, so coming to literature through social sciences has been particularly exciting, because I think we know that our music, our literature, our arts, our creative expressions, they have the capacity to capture our imaginations, right? They have the capacity to speak to the hearts and minds, and speak from the perspective of our hearts and minds and our experiences to one another, to share something. I think it's for me as someone, I remember coming up and reading novels that actually helped me better understand what was going on in my history classes, in my geography classes, in my, in my other classes. And I'm like, oh, I understand this because I read that in a novel. And I kind of understand globalization now in a different way. I understand, what's going on in the US-Mexico border a little bit better because I read, Garcia Marquez. And so that understanding of, what's happening there helps me here. And so in that way, our cultural practices are not just at the center of who we are, or center of, of some of our experiences, but also I think they can help us to reach a really broad swath of people, right? Yes. In a way that maybe our raw numbers in our white papers and our, what all these other things that we're doing are not going to reach folks, right? Our graphs and our charts. But that the murals will, that our short stories and our novels will. I mean, we can think about the work of Pura Teresa Belpré, right? My mother growing up in Puerto Rico and, born in 1954, she came to my house recently, was looking at my books, and she was like, ¿Tú tienes ese libro de la cucaracha? And so she's like, and I'm like, Pura Teresa Belpré. And I thought it was so incredible for me to think that my mom, who grew up in La Barriada Morales in Caguas, right? Remembers this children's book that was produced by a Black Puerto Rican librarian in New York City.
Yeah.
right? Like that for her is like, and I'm like, wow, I can't believe that that's something, you know, and now I'm trying to find the books for her so she can have her own collection of these texts. And so in that way, not only is our like work, our artistic productions in the world so critical to our future, but also the way that it is expressed and shared, particularly to our young people. I'm thinking about
Right.
K through 12, I'm thinking about children's books, I'm thinking about young adult narratives. All of these kinds of things become so important as people come to consciousness, as Lisa Sanchez Gonzalez says in Boricua literature, right? Come to consciousness about who we are, particularly for those of us coming of age in the diaspora, where we're getting so many mixed messages about who we are as a people, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that I've always talked with my friend who is a philosopher, Boricua philosopher, Cerces Mendez, you know, we talked about the fact that growing up, her in Ohio and me in New York, New Jersey, we knew the narrative about what Puerto Ricans are. You're pathological, you guys are all on welfare, you guys don't finish school, you're poor, you're lazy, unemployed, que sé yo. We already know what everybody thinks of us, right? For us, it's much more important to figure out who we are for ourselves, right? And how we think about ourselves in the world. And that narrative is the one that takes precedent. And so much of that happens in our artistic spaces. And I think that the arts are a place of connection. And, you know, in terms of thinking about the question of belonging, one of the places that I have been for the past few years is abandoning the question of ni de aquí, ni de allá, right? And saying, actually, no, soy de aquí y de allá, right? Y ya, you know? And for me, that has been a place through which to rethink what we do, the value of our work, our words, and our arts and our practices. So yeah, thank you.
That's beautiful. I might appropriate that. I always say que soy del vaivén because I feel like I am of the movement. And all my friends, they never know. Am I in New York? Am I in Puerto Rico? Like, ¿dónde está ella? Because I feel like I'm in that. I live somewhere in that in between, you know. But I like this idea of living in both, you know, rather than in between.
Yeah.
Arcadio, ¿qué nos dices?
Well, I appreciate what Yomaira has stated, and literature and the arts for me have been everything. I mean, I come from a very large family on both sides, from Gurabo and Caguas. And they migrated. There were no books in the family or no whatsoever, and I was. I mean, I appreciate the knowledges that they had, and so rich as a culture. But the books were not there. I mean, I was one of the first in the families, and they migrated. 90% of the family, part of the big migration of the late 40s and 50s, 12 uncles and 15 on the other side. And so I learned a lot about migration through them too. La Memoria Rota really owes a lot to them. But it owes a lot also to writers and artists. I was lucky to be at that university, even though the gag law, La Ley de la Mordaza, was part of it too. And I discovered books, and I discovered writers like Pedro Juan Soto and José Luis González and René Marquez, and of course, Julia de Burgos, huh? And later my friend, Ángela María Dávila, and so many others, Luis Rafael Sánchez. And then from Alma Concepcion, my wife, I discovered what dance had to offer in terms of vision and practice and performance. And now my daughter, too, is a choreographer and dancer. And I think I have learned so much about issues, social issues, about the way the body thinks and the body can express itself and innovate, recordando el futuro imaginario, no? And about the way writers, I learned so much about New York before I even went there to visit my family, from reading the short stories Speaks by Pedro Juan Soto, because it was not taught even at the university. There was not a word. I studied in the Humanidades for 4 years, and I had very good teachers. But migration and, of course, anything related to what we call diaspora was not a topic. No? And, of course, communists and nationalists was not even existing. No? So I remember how much I owe to those writers, and I appreciate that, and I value that. So, and then I was, as years went by, I discovered more and more writers and artists, and I would say for me it's a top priority. Huh? It's and it still is today. Very often I learn more about the social issues and the political dilemmas from artists. That's why I wanted also to begin today with that poster by Antonio Martorell, because and if I think of Rafael Tufino or Lorenzo Omar or so many others, a whole, there's a Teatrum Mundi, there's a memory, a cultural memory, a historical memory in the graphic arts. The first image I saw of Betances, because Betances did not exist in my family or in my school years. It was never mentioned. And the first image I saw, I was a university student in Rio Piedras, and it was a poster by Tufino. And I said, who is this person? And it was, then I became interested in Betances. Why he's never mentioned here? I think it's important. Carlos Raquel Rivera, for instance, no? His graphic art. There's no way I can even think of Puerto Rican history and culture without art, visual art, performers, dance, choreographers, writers, and poets. No? Julia de Burgos, even if we have to discuss, because writers are to be discussed, Pales Matos, no, and Llorens Torres, or let's say current writers. And the good news is that is well and alive, that we have a wonderful, we have a wonderful literature, new poets, new writers. I keep getting and reading books that are really as important, and maybe I want to add this, that the richness of scholarly work by scholars in the island, in the archipelago, and the diaspora is amazing. This is, and I can vouch to that. And now, during these years of retirement and pandemic, I have been able to read more and to read and to try to keep up with and it's amazing. It's wonderful. This is I think a moment of great brilliance and intelligence and commitment to scholarly work in English and Spanish, in the diaspora and in the archipelago. If I had to teach a seminar now, I would have so many possibilities, the resources, and I'm learning every day. Literally, every day I'm learning, no? From new books, new essays, new questions, historians, sociologists, Aldo Lauria's questions about what does it mean to be a citizen, really, or a class, or is class identity more important than national identity? All those new questions again, or Yomaira's questions about the connections to Africa. What does it mean in terms of language too, and a new vision of the third world? That's what I think that book is, to Yomaira's book, a new take and a brilliant one. And we also have all this. I went to the Whitney Museum exhibit. I was so happy that I was invited to be part of it in the catalog. But the exhibition itself is so inspiring, and most of them are very, very and good. And those artists are very young, most of them, no? And curators, Marcela, Jasmine was there too. I think we have a whole new group of curators. In that sense, it's dramatic too, because there is so many signs of dispossession, destruction, danger, violence, economic violence, to this neoliberal, I really, I don't even know what word to use, the way they dismiss the dehumanization is the word I want. Dehumanization by neoliberalism. And I think, and yet we have this great group of writers and artists who are very active, creating and thinking, because that's what they are doing. And sometimes it's even more interesting than what academics have to say.
I agree. or at the very least complementary and just as important. I appreciated Yomaira's, comments and your own about how the pathways that literature can create. For me, even though I grew up in Topeka and in Arizona when I was a young child, the concept of diaspora, I learned it as a college student in La Biblioteca Lázaro at UPR. Reading La Carreta Made a U-Turn. I still remember where I was sitting and reading it in La Lázaro and discovering this whole cultural world, and that experience is something that every part of academia is important and contributes, but there certainly is a kind of special magic about the way in which literature opens up the imagination and transports us to other experiences. And as an anthropologist, that's part of my bread and butter as well, is to try to think about all these different experiences, ways of being in relationship with each other, even through our differences. Yomaira unfortunately had to run to go catch her flight to go dig into the Espada archives, but we thank her. And Arcadio, we thank you. And I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow we will be having our full day Anniversary Symposium, where we will be opening our doors, welcoming back some of the founders of CENTRO, and thinking through, we will have 3 major panels. The first one about the founding of CENTRO, Aprender a Luchar, Luchar es Aprender, that those political imperatives of that moment and how we can think with them today. We will also be having an award ceremony honoring certain founders and other, important figures for us at CENTRO. Our second panel is called Retrofuturism, which is the ethos that we've been carrying through in this 50th anniversary, which is to get back in touch with the roots of CENTRO, the founding principles of CENTRO as we think about the future. So in that panel, we'll be welcoming current scholars, young scholars innovating in the field and helping us think through the future of Puerto Rican studies. And then the third panel is about the art of research and researching art, where we will be welcoming curators, including Marcela Guerrera, who curated the Whitney show, to think about the current surge of curators and the current moment of Puerto Rican arts and its relation to the changing landscape in Puerto Rico. So we hope everyone can join. It is in person. It will not be live streamed, but it will be recorded and posted to the web later on. So we are bringing back FOMO tomorrow, as it will not be live streamed, but we will as the archive that we will record it and make it available to everyone. So gracias mil, Arcadio, por ayudarnos a desearle happy birthday a CENTRO.
Sí, and thank you to the founders and to all the persons that have developed this CENTRO and have created it for us. Let's just remember utopia. We have to remember utopia, and they taught us how to do that. And
yes.
Working. Thank you so much. Gracias.
Gracias, everybody.